For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. On the gist today, our guest is Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya, India's ex-envoy to Afghanistan. Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, good to talk about Afghanistan, though the situation is not very good there still after a while. But the recent developments, I mean, there's always been tension across the Durand, even after the Taliban took place. And initially, it may have been skirmishes, clashes, mortar, even artillery. But now these reported airstrikes which have killed dozens. Do you see that an escalation up the ladder, and why has it happened?
Well, to the extent that, we haven't had such brazen airstrikes in the past, it is definitely an escalation. By and large, it was mostly confined to artillery shelling and occasional sort of cross-border operations. So yes, there has been an escalation. And if you're asking what can account for this escalation, it's clearly that, as we have seen, starting as early as back as, towards the autumn of last year, TTP attacks against Pakistan have renewed and revived. And in fact, I have reports that very recently they have been even higher than normal. And quite naturally, the suspicion is, and the Pakistani army suspects, that many of them are operating from across the Durand Line, which I don't call the boundary, across on the Afghan side. There is no question that also Pakistani military operations have thrust very large numbers of ordinary refugees and civilians also across on the other side, who are taking shelter on the other side. And it is not inconceivable that there may be, militants and TTP elements and terrorists who are amongst those refugees. Nevertheless, airstrikes is a fairly severe escalation when you know that there are refugees in their midst.
How do you see the reactions, whether it's from the Taliban themselves when they summon the Pakistani ambassador? Right. That must be a first for them. Well, and then the Pakistani statements as well.
Right. So, as you mentioned yourself, tensions and frictions have existed ever since the Taliban came into power. And it was only to be expected that these would actually get worse for various reasons. One is, there has always been chafing at Pakistani tutelage and almost total control over the Taliban through various means, many of them quite underhand. But apart from that, one of the prime purposes behind the entire Pakistani project in Afghanistan is to turn the whole Pashtun question outward towards other ethnicities, towards Central Asia, maybe towards India, towards ideological radical Islam. And in some ways try to erase or at least eclipse the kind of Pashtun identity that links both sides together. And clearly what we are seeing is, yes, there has been some success in their project, but you cannot, blood is thicker than water, and you cannot erase these ties entirely. All the more so when you think that, after all, the Taliban were attacked post 9/11 by the United States for what? For not handing over, Al-Qaeda leaders like Osama bin Laden. Yeah. So if they were not willing to do that, given Pashtun traditions of Mehmaniyat and so on, it's inconceivable that the Taliban would just hand over or give up people who are of Pashtun ethnicity, who are effectively their kindred across the border. So the Taliban has to protest. Actually, Afghan national sentiment is even much stronger, very anti-Pakistani at this moment, particularly on account of this, but because of the entire Taliban project on Afghanistan. But really the question is, what can they do about it? Pakistan has ensured that any Afghan army is kept emasculated. And almost certainly that is the case with the Taliban as well. And already we have seen a toning down of their reaction, and also a willingness to say that Afghan soil will not be used against Pakistan. But again, that is what they say. What they can actually do is another question.
The whole TTP question, like you're saying, it seems like attacks have gone up post the Taliban taking over in Kabul itself. So how does that dynamic work? If the Taliban are a child of the ISI,
Right.
and they still have their own constituency, like you're pointing out, that they
Right.
can't really give up. So are they trying to assert their independence from Rawalpindi, or are they stuck? Is it a conundrum?
So Afghan Taliban and TTP,
Yeah.
we should realize that they are part of the same phenomenon. They are part of the same phenomenon of the radicalism that the Pakistanis, the ISI itself,
Sure.
many of the mullahs, the radical preachers, Gulf elements have fomented consciously as a ideological project in the in the border areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan, initially as a first step intended for to recover, recapture, and reclaim Afghanistan. So they are in many ways the same kind of people. And on top of that, you have the contradiction that the Taliban agenda for the Pakistani ISI, or for the Pakistani deep state or establishment, the Taliban agenda, Afghan Taliban agenda in Afghanistan is a good thing, but that same ideology, the same objectives in Pakistan are not welcome. In fact, they are treated as terrorists. So they are freedom fighters on the other side and terrorists here. As far as the Afghan Taliban and the TTP are concerned, they see themselves as the same, and they're pursuing the same objectives. Now, quite naturally, and everybody knew this, that a Taliban victory in Afghanistan was going to embolden all the radical elements that have been associated and affiliated together for the last 25 years. Whether they are Central Asian, whether they are Pak-based, Kashmir-oriented outfits, sectarian, Shia-Sunni-oriented outfits. Today we hear of a suicide attack in Dasht-e-Barchi once again, or against Iran or against the West. I mean, whether it is Al-Qaeda or ISKP or anyone else. So, the fact is that it's a much larger conglomerate of groups. And the TTP is in many ways the closest. In fact, I'm not surprised that the TTP is the most active, because they are the closest to the Taliban. They are actually linked by ethnicity and kinship. The Central Asians and others are, to that extent, 1 degree removed.
When you talk about the Pakistani project in Afghanistan, so-called project, is it too early to say it's a Pyrrhic victory in terms of what has happened there, with the Americans going not so much attention on Pakistan, the money not coming in, they're not being able to monetize it, so as to speak, crudely?
I think that was kind of expected.
Yeah.
I think they were also taking a lot of gambles. As far as their immediate objective was to get rid of the Americans. Once you've got rid of the Americans, you take over the country. Then their objective was to try and get the Chinese into the picture, so that the Chinese, with their strategic heft and clout and economic muscle, they would somehow be able to stabilize them. Both sides would try to piggyback on each other. Pakistan would be the eyes and ears. China would provide the muscle. And they would be able to continue to dominate and control and, exercise tutelage over Afghanistan. This time in the name of geoeconomics, not so much in the name of strategic depth, but it's the same thing. So I think the objectives have not changed. Domination remains the game. Pakistan has always feared that it will not work. So they've always kept, margin, an insurance project, or they've always kept alternative horses that they can use. So during the Mujahideen period, when they realized that people like Ahmed Shah Massoud and many other leaders had gone against them and, in fact, joined the anti-Taliban resistance, they still cultivated, people like Hekmatyar and the Taliban, who was their prime project. Now, within the Taliban, they have their favorites and their non-favorites. So Pakistan's ultimate objective is that if it cannot subjugate, then at least to keep Afghanistan unstable, boiling, so that it can never be turned against it. But that is a big gamble that they are taking, because instability can bite everyone. And in this case, given the recent history of animosity, Pakistan is probably likely to be the country singed first.
And when you say an insurance policy, is the ISKP something of that sort? We've seen recent reports suggesting that there are attacks into Uzbekistan as well.
Yeah, this is a messy picture. Scholars have documented links between the ISKP and the ISI, and even the Lashkar-e-Taiba, or at least individual leaders of the Lashkar-e-Taiba, and particularly between the Haqqani group and the ISKP. At the same time, there are, ideological issues and turf battles and leadership battles, and also this whole issue of, of loyalty, of obeisance to a particular leader. So very often ISKP has been the more radical pole and also the more sectarian pole, which has attracted those who have, let's say, been dissatisfied with either the Al-Qaeda or with the Taliban. So they are there as a magnet. And the exact nature of the relationship is something to be studied more, but there are contacts. I mean, I'll give you just one example. One of the first acts post August 15 was the massive airport blast, which killed, scores of Afghans and a few American soldiers as well. And this happened when Kabul was under the control of the Haqqanis and the airport was under the control of the Haqqanis. So the fact that such a thing happened means that there is something that is beyond either the Haqqanis and the Taliban in being able to control the situation, or that there is some degree of complicity. And, this obviously is an unresolved question, but both possibilities are open. And that should alert us to the kind of dangers of this kind of, fanning this kind of extremism and instability and the different factions that it generates and so on.
Since August, almost a year now, how do you see India's position vis-a-vis Afghanistan? I mean, of course, are we in a conundrum to not recognize the Taliban yet deal with the Afghan people's humanitarian crisis? And we've seen wheat and medicines, of course.
Yeah. So I think there are 2 or 3 considerations. One is it's very clear, events like this, like pull out of the Soviet Union, pull out of US troops, take a long time to unravel. And it is not actually particularly helpful or wise to start jumping to conclusions. And, so there has to be, let's say, a period of watch and wait. One. Second, there has to be a period of, okay, who serve your interests better? Whether, a kind of democratic, more moderate dispensation or an extremist dispensation should serve you better. I'm sure, our policy makers are clear about what they have in mind. The third is, what do you do in the meantime? And the fourth is, what is your ultimate objective? Is it the people or is it just whoever is in power? And invariably, there's a bit of a mix of all that in the calculations. So I would say that I think one point that is coming through is that we are not abandoning the Afghan people, and that is shown and demonstrated through our wheat shipments, our medical assistance, and so on. But whether we are doing enough, that's an open question, because maybe it is considerations of security, but certainly we could have been much more hospitable to Afghans wanting to visit India, whether it's for education or for health or just simply shelter, So that is one element. And B, there will always be certain compulsions, particularly if you even if you're talking about humanitarian assistance. If they are in power, there will always be some compulsions to deal with someone. But I would go slow on recognition. In an article that I had written soon after the takeover, I had talked about kind of steps that could be taken, well short of recognition. And no country has officially recognized the Taliban as yet. So I don't think India would be anywhere amongst the first. And I think, the situation in Afghanistan is still too unstable for us to take any decision like that. It's not at all clear how long the Taliban will last. Last time they lasted 5.5 years. But
in power.
They are in power. They are ruling.
They
are ruling
longer.
purely with the use of force, right? And how long that can last is a very open question. So I would not bet on that.
There is contact.
Yeah.
We don't know publicly at what level and how much and what is happening between India and the Taliban, most likely in Qatar. But the Russians have opened or allowed the Taliban to open an embassy in Moscow. Everybody is dealing with the Taliban. Do you think there should be some kind of reinvigoration of diplomatic
No.
or
So,
at least
you know,
representative, Indians
right.
representative there.
Right. Personally, I still think it's too early. That we are dealing to some extent even openly, because at least one of those meetings was open, and at the diplomatic level, I think that is there. I don't know about whether the Taliban has actually opened an embassy. So far, they had been denying that they were planning to recognize or open an embassy. They may have allowed an office. I'm not quite sure. So these are important distinctions on the whole issue of recognition. As I said, given the situation, given the very fluid situation, given the fact that there is a strong resistance to the Taliban inside, which they are trying to put down by force, even as currently there are very serious reports of violations of human rights, of people, of ANDSF people being, invited to return and then being, to use that term, disappeared or killed. So, I don't think we are anywhere near the situation where the Taliban is either going to be able to provide security or governance, let alone inclusiveness and rights and women's rights and minority rights and many other things. So I would say that, there is no need for us to feel under any pressure to hurry. Other countries may be doing things for their own interests, which may be different from ours. I mean, Russia may be doing things out of geopolitics, which are not our geopolitics. So I don't think we should get mix up our interests with others, and we should follow our own course.
You're talking about internal resistance. I mean, how much has that resistance manifested in terms of military opposition?
So they have, one of the things that Taliban has done fairly efficiently, and they had an operation a few weeks back, if you remember, is to try and clear many of the centers of resistance of any weapons, of any form of arms. And they have gone about it pretty ruthlessly, and I would say to some extent efficiently. Vehicles, anything that could be utilized for a kind of offensive. In spite of that, we are getting reports, and reports are quite limited. We are getting reports of resistance in places like Panjshir, in Andarab, in Badakhshan also there was a large movement. So let's put it like this: resistance is not dead, and a lot of resistance is latent. It is kind of seething inside, and they will see when a messiah or a leader or it gets momentum. That's exactly what happened in 9/11. For 9/11, the distaste for the Taliban was kept suppressed. But post 9/11, once the Americans started their bombardment, against the Al-Qaeda, and the Northern Alliance came to life, and the country got liberated for 20 years after that. So let's not forget that many of much resistance depends on leadership and momentum.
You talked about Russia and geoeconomics, Bajwa's favorite term, I think, nowadays. But how do you see China fitting in here? They are continuing to also have meetings with China, Pakistan, Afghanistan.
Yeah. So, for China, it's a bit of a poison chalice. At one level, the fact that the Americans have left, have vacated the strategic territory at their weakest underbelly in Xinjiang is a big positive for China at the time that, US-China rivalry was really sort of hotting up and was shifting towards, and the US focus was shifting towards Asia. But not just the negative aspect. I think China would also see, a kind of strategic space in Afghanistan to reach out to Iran, with which it has a long geo-economic deal, 400 billion, 25-year geo-economic deal with strategic interests. It is looking at the Americans kind of lowering their profile in West Asia and handing it over to the so-called West Asian Quad. And it sees this as an opening to make a strategic entry into West Asia as well. And I think most importantly, it is also an alternative, kind of through the pressure that they face from the Quad and from the AUKUS in the Indo-Pacific, South China Sea, Malacca Straits, Indian Ocean. So China has very good strategic reasons to move into through Afghanistan, if not into Afghanistan. using, of course, their strongest instrument, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as, checkbook, mostly for their own interests. Actually, nothing is really for Afghan interests, and their partnership with Pakistan. At the same time, they have concerns about radicalism, extremism, instability, Islamism, particularly insofar as it affects Xinjiang. They have been very ruthless and efficient in suppressing that. But I think China realizes that you cannot only deal with the etim, that the etim is part of a much larger phenomenon. And are they ready to take on the entire conglomerate of radical outfits that have something in common, which are against the West, against leftist or secular or liberal dispensations anywhere in the world, united by their Islamist philosophy. And it would be, so I think it is caught between the devil and the deep blue sea on that. Nevertheless, what is important is that they have positioned themselves much better. And what they are doing right now is to preserve that position that they can utilize as and when circumstances seem ripe. Of late, they have been a little more active. They had started off with a certain level of activity. In between, they had been a bit subdued. They seem to have resurfaced, particularly with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Afghanistan and subsequently to South Asia. So it seems as though they feel that there is some future in Afghanistan for them, and they are maintaining their position for the time being. But they haven't placed any risky major investment on it as yet. And also, perhaps the Ukraine events may have also contributed to it, because it's quite easily possible that Central Asia could also open up as another theater of the larger geopolitics, and they want to remain in position there.
Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, as usual, thank you for your time, your experience, and your expertise.
Thank you. My pleasure. Good to be back to StratNews.
And on StratNews Global, you can leave your comments about this interview and our other interviews. Do follow our social media handles as well for the latest perspective from New Delhi. You're watching Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh.